Isaiah 48:20. Go ye forth of Babylon, flee ye from the Chaldeans. With a voice of singing declare ye. Tell this, utter it even to the end of the earth. Say, yea, Yahuwah has redeemed his servant, Yaqub. Shalom, Yasharala. Welcome to another From Roots to Branches. In this episode, we're really going to dive into birth of a narrative. What do I mean? Well, we're really going to talk about how these narratives of implicit bias, subconscious conditioning, microaggressions, stigma and stereotype, how it was really birthed within the fibers of American history. Now, so much of the ways that the quote-unquote so-called black community has been depicted on an international scale has everything to do with media. But when did it start? Now, there's a history of pickaninnies and there's a history of just lowbrow, big lip, watermelon eating black folks. That's been a part of history for a long time, not just in cinema, but it's also been a part of images that were sold as actual campaigns to sell different products and just a variety of different levels in the ways that the quote-unquote so-called black community had been marginalized within these images. And it really did mold the ways that the rest of the world were able to openly discriminate against this community of us. So when I go into this narrative, it's an important thing for us to historically really be reminded in the ways that Jay-Z reminded so many of us within his album that he dropped with the video and, O.J. Simpson and all of that. We're really going to dive into where did those narratives actually come from? How did those narratives really impact us? And what does that do to your subconscious conditioning? Now, one of the first films that we can actually reference and go back to that actually was a huge part of the ways that we look at one another historically was Birth of a Nation. Now, in 1915, 50 years after the end of the Civil War, D.W. Griffith, he released an epic film, Birth of a Nation. It was one of the greatest blockbusters of the silent era. Birth of a Nation was seen by an estimated 200 million Americans by 1946. Now, it was based on a novel by a Baptist preacher named Thomas Dixon. The film painted the reconstruction of the period following the Civil War. Now, within the film, it's depicted as a vengeful former enslaved people, opportunistic white scallywags, and corrupt Yankee carpetbaggers plunged and oppressed the former Confederacy until the respectable white Southerners rose up and restored order. Now, just for reference, a scallywag was a white Southerner who supported the Republican Party, which at that time were actually the Democrats, and a carpetbagger was a Northerner born a Republican who had migrated to the South. Now, the film itself, it really just depicted Northern congressman who modeled on Pennsylvania congressman and Thaddeus Stevens, who was a power-hungry mulatto eager to marry the congressman's daughter. Now, one of the things that we have to really understand is during that time, mixing was illegal. It was already outlawed. So the fact that they made a film that actually depicted that, it just really fired up the whole narrative even more. Now, during the 20th century, far more Americans probably learned about the Reconstruction from a Hollywood lens rather than from actual historical books and lectures. So films like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, it really depicted the Reconstruction and misguided the attempt to overturn this Southern natural order by giving political power to a former enslaved people. That was something that drove fear in most Southern whites, but let's keep it real. Not just the Southern whites were fearful of this. We got to think 200 million Americans seen that. That means not just in the South. All right. So as we go into this really depiction of what it was for so-called black folks to really actually be degraded on an international scale, if you really want to get down to the root of it, because this film wasn't just popular here in America. We also have to actually understand that because America was one of the first places to actually make film, internationally they're looking at this film, and internationally they are building biases, stigmas, and stereotypes about the quote unquote so-called black community based off of this film. Now, there was a pushback from the NAACP when this movie actually dropped. I mean, they did have a vocalization at the table about the things that were currently happening, but it was almost better for the NAACP and those who were quote unquote considered black leaders at the time to not really dive into this too deeply, because there was a lot of political things that were at the table. One of the things that we have to understand is that anytime that politics play into actual change, there's always going to be a tug of war pull on what you can and you can't say, just because it doesn't benefit politics to actually be controversial, even to this day, right? So when we talk about this so-called narrative of blackness and the ways that it's really been molded and sculpted and put into the fibers of not just America, but the rest of the world, we understand that why the children of Israel, right, the stolen identity, is such a controversial thing when we actually start digging and researching and pulling up our own history and receipts. We're considered less than human in the narrative of America. And the thing about that is, if you're always starting history from slavery, then you're never able to see anything great about who you are. In fact, anytime we get out of the narrative of slavery, there is some oppressor who wants to make sure that we go back into that narrative. But the funny thing about it is the rest of the world doesn't realize as soon as we get free, they'll get free. It's an accountability factor that comes into actually healing. And yes, the so-called black community definitely has to heal from the trauma that was caused onto us for all of these generations, 400 plus years. But so do the rest of those who actually put that oppression on us. In fact, there's an accountability that still has to be had, right? For every action, there's a reaction, right? Too much is given, much is required. These are things that we have to remember when we're talking about the curses that come from the Bible, but these are also things that those who oppressed us, those who come from those ancestors, also have to take into account. Because the hard thing about real history, the hard thing about actually looking at who we have been, is that the accountability factor has to be taken into consideration in order for healing to happen.